Thank you all for being here. Thanks to GGDA for inviting me to talk. This is a really great opportunity for me. Oftentimes when I'm giving these types of talks, I'm in a room where I'm the content expert about the video game industry. That clearly is not the case tonight, which is a great way for me to learn more about the space that I'm studying. And so I really, really would appreciate any feedback you have about my work, both in terms of kind of the theory and the models that I'll be presenting, but also in terms of the context, which you all participate in on a daily basis. So I'm going to give a talk about a working paper I have, which is called Abandoned Video Games, Organizational Knowledge and New Product Development. This is work that comes from my dissertation, which I wrapped up a year ago before I started at Georgia State. As Abby said, I'm also the research chair of the Global Game Jam and have some data about the Global Game Jam that I can present to you, more descriptive data afterward if you have questions about that as well. So just kind of get us started a little bit here. The motivation for my work out of my dissertation and my work in the video game industry is that we know that product development and new product development is extremely important to firms, that over 50% of sales are generated from new products. But we also know that kill rates are extremely high and failure rates are extremely high. 95% of new product developments fail to result in economic returns. It's one study. About 7.8 ideas are needed for every new product success. And we see about only 35% of ideas that make it past the screening stage ever get commercialized. So in this world of new product development that is so important to firms, we have these huge failure rates, and we don't really have a strong understanding of why this occurs. And that's really kind of what motivated this study for me. From a theoretical side, we know a little bit about abandonment, which is what my primary interested in. I'm really interested in organizational adaptation and why organizations change their behavior. And there's a long tradition of this from the behavioral theory of the firm, Sire to March in the Carnegie School, that looks at organizational learning and probabilistic search processes. This kind of process is basically organizations set aspiration levels. So you set an aspiration level, and when you fail to meet that aspiration level, the firm or organization would initiate a search process to try to identify why it's failing to reach those aspiration levels, look for alternatives. In the worst case scenario, you might abandon your current course of action if you fail to find a solution for your problem. So, what we know from the literature is what causes firms to fail to reach their aspiration levels, especially when it comes to new product development. It's a whole host or litany of things. Everything from technical issues to issues or problems among team members, failure of proper project planning or implementing the plans, may lack expertise. These are all issues that come up in largely ethnographic research on why new product development initiatives are canceled or killed. In the large-scale empirical work, there's primarily two assumptions that are made when we look at abandonment as a form of organizational change. Those two primary assumptions are abandonment is an outcome of probabilistic search principles. When you fail to find solutions to problems, you kill the idea. You stop your current course of action and you change behavior. The second primary assumption is that post-implementation performance is available, it's known. So many of these studies, what we're looking at is we implement, say, a management program, such as a matrix management program. And we look at how it performs over time, and we compare that to our aspiration levels, how we expect it to perform, and we look at social aspirations, meaning we look at our peers and say, how are we performing compared to our peers? But we have some form of post-implementation performance available. So, in terms of my study contributions, what I'm looking at is relaxing some of those assumptions in other work. What I'm really interested in is what happens when abandonment is not always an outcome of failed probabilistic search. So are there situations when we would kill a project not because of problems that we have, we're maintaining our performance on an iterative basis, meaning we're reaching those milestones we expect to reach, but we still decide to kill that project. The second contribution is we're going to relax the assumption that post-implementation performance is not available. And this happens routinely in new product development initiatives because most performance metrics for a new product development, or a video game in this case, would be how does it do on the market? Do we have a lot of sales? Do we commercialize the game? That's the performance that we're interested in. There are other performance metrics too in terms of creativity or innovation. We have intermediate or milestone performance metrics. But the post-implementation isn't available until you've already decided to commercialize the project, you've sold it, or you've killed it, at which point you wouldn't have performance metric other than you stopped developing the game. What I'm really interested in is the source of organizational knowledge. Most prior studies of abandonment have been looking at what's called interorganizational learning, where we look at other organizations' decisions and we glean information from there and apply it to our own organization. And as you can imagine, when you're developing a new game, you may not know how many other companies are developing those games. They may not tell you they're developing a new game. Especially if this is your first one, you may have localized knowledge about other game companies that you're familiar with, but it's not something you can systematically sample on because there are infinite amount of games available that might be in a development stage. But my focus is on interorganizational knowledge, meaning we're not going to learn from other organization abandonment events because we may not be aware of them. We have to look internally at the organization, what kind of knowledge structures may influence why and when an organization abandon those projects. So in terms of abandonment pathways, the classic model again is we're trying to make a decision under uncertainty. And each period an organization has two choices. It's typically referred to in the literature as a bandit model. You have two choices, and you've updated your preferences after each period. The two choices you have are, should we continue to develop this game in the next period? Another choice would be, we're going to select a different course of action. We're not going to develop this game anymore. We're going to pursue a different opportunity. We're going to shut down the firm completely. Those are the two choices you have period to period. And the choice is based on a perceived expected value of each alternative. So if you decide to continue developing your game, the assumption is you perceive that expected value or the return from that game development to be higher than the alternatives that you could otherwise pursue. And if you choose to not pursue that game development project, you've opted to say, we think the expected value of something else is higher. Now, the literature assumes that the reason the others are higher is because the expected value of your current initiative has gone down or diminished in some way. We failed to reach aspiration levels. Initiated a probabilistic search are unable to find solutions. The value of this current initiative is going down. That's the problem-related pathway. But the literature is full of anecdotes, and my field research that I conducted in the video game industry definitely demonstrates that there's an alternative pathway to why you might abandon a project. It doesn't have to do with killing a project or abandoning it because of problems, but rather it's not the expected value of your current initiative that's gone down, but the expected value of an alternative now supersedes your current initiative. You're not failing to reach your aspiration levels on your current project. There's just new opportunities that emerge that are more valuable. And so you abandon through an opportunity. So does anyone know who Max Levchin is? Max Levchin? Okay. Just one? Get an idea for cryptography for handheld devices in 1998? Kind of like palm to palm, beam back and forth. It would be secure. You could share information. This idea was purchased for $1.5 billion in 2002 by eBay. Only one person knows of this, and they purchased for $1.5 billion this idea.
Sorry.
You don't know? You guys know who PayPal is?
Yes.
Does that have anything to do with beaming between palms? No.
That sounds like that red light that they used that was really slow and
On the
like
palm.
a particle got.
On the palm?
I don't know. I just remember seeing like it's like a light that's supposed to transfer.
Yeah. So, you know,
Yeah.
when you're my age, you used to do some work in development, and that was his idea, though, is that we would have secure transactions between palms or handheld devices before we all had iPhones and smartphones. You would just share information by being in the back and forth. You'd have to make sure they're lined up, and it was awful training. I trained people on it. It was awful. Well, that was Max's idea that eventually pivoted. He killed that idea, abandoned that idea to pursue a new opportunity. And it wasn't so much that the idea was bad, that he was failing to reach aspiration levels in that idea. It's another idea emerged through his discussions, through his iterations of that idea that turned into PayPal. This just demonstrates an example of how a firm can go through an iteration and kill a project not because it's failing to reach its aspiration levels or goals, but rather new opportunities emerge which lead it to abandon the original idea.
You used this before, didn't you?
Yeah, we talked.
I still hate this one.
You hate this one?
Yeah, because they
You
didn't
like
really.
this one better?
No, but they
Yes,
pivoted, but
more
they
colors.
used this cryptography. They didn't throw it away, they didn't just abandon. They already had all the tools in place to be able to make the shift, and that's why they did it, not because, they didn't throw it away. It wasn't like a totally new idea, it was just a better direction.
Absolutely, and I'm not making any assumptions that, I should be clear with this, there are no assumptions in my models or my theory that say when a firm abandons a particular course of action, that they are scrapping everything that they learned before and starting brand new from square one. In fact, most of the theory that I build on is that you're engaged in learning endogenous to the firm, not meaning you're getting extra information from outside, but learning through each other and learning through that work that's building on it and developing into new opportunities. But maybe I'll pull that out when I do my next. You remember this one?
No.
Game Never Ending. Anyone heard Game Never Ending? This one's from the games industry.
Grand Theft Auto?
Close.
School graphic.
Game Never Ending.
It's a never-ending story.
It was a game that was trying to be built. That was a never-ending game. Acquired for $35 million. Game Never Ending was acquired for $35 million. Of course, it really wasn't Game Never Ending that was acquired for $35 million. It was Flickr.
Whoa.
Flickr was an opportunity that emerged out of this Game Never Ending. The initial game sparked an idea that they could have a photo sharing app. This gets to your point again. It's not that they killed the whole idea of this Game Never Ending and said, oh, this is a horrible idea, let's start brand new and over. Through the development process of Game Never Ending, a new idea emerged to the development team. They wanted to create a tool within their game that would allow their users to share photos. Well, that photo sharing tool that they were developing for their game emerged as a far more lucrative, a better opportunity than the game itself. So the firm shifted out of development of the never-ending game to the development of this alternative pathway or alternative idea called Flickr. And then they eventually sold it to Yahoo for $35 million. So again, these are just illustrations of the possibility that when you kill a project, it isn't always just because the original idea was bad or that it didn't produce the outcomes that you wanted it to produce. It's just simply saying that there's this whole other set of opportunities out there for why and when a firm might decide to kill or abandon their project. So again, I was more interested in the intra-organizational forms of knowledge that might influence why and when. There's a long literature of organizations learning from other organizations or other actors. So if you're building Game Never Ending, you might be learning from other organizations building a similar game. And saying, hey, you know what? They're all killing their games, so guess what we should do? Maybe that's telling us that the market for this game is bad. But that's a very difficult premise, especially within the video game industry. Where learning from other organizations is more opaque. It's not transparent. We don't have information. So in a study done of the radio industry and looking at changing platforms, listening platforms, it's very clear. When you watch your competitors and your peers change a platform to a different platform, it's an uncertain environment, but when you watch them change, what does that tell you? That tells you maybe there is information we don't have privately that this is not the best platform for us to be producing music in or that's what I'm looking for. Broadcasting, thank you, broadcasting music in. But in the video game industry, it's not that transparent. You may know what your peers are doing individually, but you don't know in a whole spectrum of what are all the universe of games that are out there being developed and how alike they are to your game. In fact, you're probably more aware, my hypothesis in this room is, you're probably more aware, each of you who are building games right now, you're probably more aware of the folks who are building games that are dissimilar from you than the ones who are building similar games to you. That would be my hypothesis. I don't have any concrete evidence, but given the conversations I've had with game developers, that tends to be more of the case. So, in terms of intra-organizational knowledge, what I'm really interested in is the development team. Specifically, something called knowledge of who knows what. So socially shared knowledge of other individuals' expertise. It was originated out of the psychology literature by Wegner and colleagues who were really interested in a phenomenon that they were observing between partners, pairs of people. And what they were observing was that when two people were in a relationship, they seemed to know more than they knew independently. So the sum of their knowledge was not the same as the total knowledge that they had as a pair. So how this plays out is, my wife knows I keep all the passwords for every single web service that we use, including hers. So if she forgets her Hotmail password, yes, she still uses Hotmail, she comes to me and asks me. She knows where the expertise resides. She knows who has that information. It's not that she has the information that she needs, she just knows where to get it. She knows where that expertise is. After Wegner started looking at dyads, or pairs of people, the management and social psychology literature picked up on looking at how teams evolve and what kind of expertise are embedded within the teams, and do the members of those teams have knowledge of that expertise. Turns out that having knowledge of who knows what allows teams to leverage that expertise when they're confronting problems. Again, it's not that every individual on the team has the same knowledge, they just know who to go to get the expertise they need. Alternatively, it serves as a basis for creativity that can lead to the emergence of new opportunities. So in a recent study by Gino and colleagues at the Carnegie School, what they did was they ran an experiment looking at teams and origami productions. And they manipulated the amount of knowledge of who knows what on the various teams. And what they found was those teams who had stronger knowledge of who knows what produced more creative or more innovative origami products than those who didn't. There wasn't a performance outcome such as how fast they could do it, or were they doing it exactly as they were told, which was done in the 90s. What they found is that it engenders more creativity. So in terms of my hypotheses, the first two hypotheses really came from my dissertation, which was I was most interested in is, hypothesis one is the likelihood of problem-related abandonment will decrease as a team's knowledge of who knows what increases. This is because you're able to leverage each other's expertise when you're confronted with problems. You know who to assign the problems to. You know where to, when information comes in, who to disseminate it to, which reduces the likelihood that you will eventually abandon because of that problem that emerges. You can identify solutions and overcome those problems. On the flip side, that same knowledge of who knows what will likely increase the likelihood of abandonment, but these abandonments will occur through new opportunities, or opportunity abandonment. Hypothesis 3 is something that I wanted to consider because ultimately I teach strategy and I'm in a business school, and so some of my colleagues care about performance. And performance in the game industry is, well, how likely are you to monetize the project? And here we have a scenario where I expect the likelihood of monetization to increase as well, given the greater knowledge of who knows what, for some of the very same causal principles that we expect in problem-related and opportunity-related. As you're trying to monetize the game, you constantly have to overcome problems. You have to overcome problems on a daily basis in an uncertain future. Part of that uncertainty is when you're developing a never-ending game, coming up with the idea of the photo sharing, coming up with creative ideas as you continue down that same course of action. It may also, those new ideas may encourage you to abandon, but when you don't abandon, you're more likely to have a product that you can eventually monetize. So, speaking to the audience that knows the industry very well, you probably already know this. So it's a $21 billion industry in 2008. It's much bigger now. In 2008, I just highlight it because my colleagues like to hear that they're surprised at this, but that was the year that it surpassed the movie industry and the music industry. in terms of size. It's a very large and important industry. Just an example that really surprises some of my colleagues is if you think of Spider-Man 3 when it was released, it was breaking box office records. In its first week alone, it topped $176 million. Of course, Halo 3 did that in 24 hours. Took a video game 24 hours to do what the box office took a week when it was breaking records. Where my data come from is I have a data set of over 10,000 video game companies. These were game companies or companies affiliated with the video game industry. I don't know if they're all developers or publishers or a mix. This is a large data set that I compiled over time from publicly available resources, many of them online, which you guys are familiar with, like Moby Games and Giant Bomb, but also going to the GDC and basically picking up every single publication that I could find, going to other conferences around video games where I could leverage those resources that they're distributing there and really just compile as large a data set as possible on potential firms for my sample. So then, spent over 700 hours stalking people. And by 700 hours, it wasn't all me. I hired some undergraduate research assistants who I paid peanuts to help me finish this work. And we had collectively spent over 700 hours. And when I say stalking people, I really do mean stalking people. Some of you may have even received my survey. I was scouring every resource I could to find contact information for these firms. So things like info at or a URL with a contact form, I mean, to that level of detail, but also just names. Any name associated with this company I tried to track down and collected in my database. I focused primarily on founders for my survey. So if you were a founder of a company and I had your name, but I didn't have any other information, well then I took it a step further and started looking through LinkedIn profiles and gathering data through other publicly available sources to try to get a way to contact the organization. One potential problem with this type of research is there tends to be a survival bias. You can imagine data on existing companies is prevalent. Data on deceased companies, not so much. It's very hard to find. And there's a problem with my modeling if I'm only looking at successful companies. For one, I'm probably going to reduce the number of abandonments because although I don't study in this particular study, you can imagine that if you monetize your first game, you're more likely to survive than if you kill your first game. And so then I lose those firms. So I tried to find as many as I could, including deceased firms. And my sampling frame was 3,721 organizations, which 22% responded to, which may sound low, but that's a fairly good response rate for social science research. It's a pretty well-respected one. I did give $5 donations to the Maid out in Oakland, California for every respondent to help fund their museum. That helped. And it also helps that the video game community is very generous with the time that they've afforded me over the years. Really, I can't tell you how many times I heard from game professionals that one of the reasons they wanted to help out was because whenever they tell their friends and family that they're in the video game industry, their most common response is, oh, so you get paid to play games all day. And so by hopefully sharing information about how complex it is, we can educate not only academia but also the general public of how advanced and sophisticated video game development actually is. So I focused on the first game development projects. This was a product of my initial field work as I was beginning to try to understand how I could design a study where I could capture this information. As you can imagine, I have to get retrospective data in many situations. These companies come from, in my final sample, from 1996 all the way up to 2013. And so if someone's answering questions from 1998 about a company, I need to know that they can answer those questions reliably. So in my field work, I tested a lot of questions and talked to a lot of founders from the late 90s all the way back to even the 80s. And I was trying to do a randomized sample of projects at first. So I was saying, okay, list off the 10 first projects or 5 first projects. And then I had a tool that would randomize and pick one of those 5. Well, inevitably, the folks from earlier times would say, I know what project that was, but I don't remember anything about it anymore. I'm sorry. But all those same people could tell me the first project they worked on, regardless if it was successful or not. It's kind of like your first child, or first, hopefully you remember all your children, I suppose, but maybe your first kiss would be a better example. The first are often very memorable. I mean, hopefully for you, you all remember your first game that you started developing, whether it was on your own or within a firm. That was certainly true of the folks that I talked to, that the first game that they developed within that firm, whether it was successful or not, was very memorable to them. So I focused on the first game development projects. Unfortunately, I have to ask a lot of questions. The survey was a fairly long survey. It took approximately 15 to 20 minutes to fill out. And as you can imagine, when someone's filling out a 15 to 20-minute survey, they sometimes don't answer all the questions, even if they start it. And my model, I need all the variables that you'll see in a moment. So it got reduced to 321 because of missing data. Many of those missing data are time variable data. So you might remember that they abandoned their first project or monetized it but didn't have the data information. And the data information, as I'll report later, is in quarters, so 3-month intervals that I need for my models. So my analytic method, so how do I take this data and then make meaning out of it? So I'm looking at event data, and in event data I use survival analysis, also called event history analysis. You find these types of analyses in the medical journals a lot because we're really interested in events survival or death. And it's the same one here for me. I'm looking at event data. So I have to take into account how duration might influence the likelihood of monetization or abandonment. You can imagine that the amount of time you spend in development may have an influence over that. So I use the Cox model. It's got a lot of benefits. It's appropriate for event data, it can handle sensor data, and allows me to do a competing risk model, which means I'm going to compare likelihoods across different event outcomes. You can't monetize if you abandon, so I have to be able to compare about those. And if you abandon through problems, you can't abandon through opportunities, so I can compare those different abandonment events. The survey I developed, I spent over 50 hours of interviewing people, 41 individuals, 40 companies, trying to ground these measures in a native language in the video game industry, focused on events to improve recall, and I tested the survey instrument with 12 different individuals. Part of the outcomes of that was I initially was calling these abandonment in the survey or killed events. How many projects did you kill? I should have known better having talked to a lot of entrepreneurs before, but when I tested it out, no one was willing to admit that they killed the project. They were just unwilling. Oh yeah, we're not working on it. I haven't worked on it for 5 years. But I'm going to get to it someday. I haven't put any resources into it. And so I had to find ways to communicate this event, which is a very real event. But on the other hand, can you ever really truly say a project is dead? Some people can. But, without getting too esoteric, unless you die, which organizations in some ways never die, does it ever end? And then even if you die, does it really ever end? Because we're talking about something that isn't real. It's a project, it's an idea, and it's being developed. So I had to communicate that. I tested a lot of different ideas and got a response to that. The word that seemed to resonate the most was interrupted. And so I used the word interrupted. But then I also had interrupted certainly is not killed or abandoned. So in the survey instrument, I had to develop a way that allowed you to at least initially say it was interrupted, and then ask questions around when it was interrupted, and have you put any resources into it since it was interrupted, and give you an opportunity to say yes, and say, okay, well, great. Is it still in development? No. Well, when did you stop looking? And formulate a way to measure when you actually stop putting resources towards the game, which is how I measure abandonment. So of the events, there's 221 initial projects. 188 of them were monetized, about 60%, 59%. 77 projects were abandoned, so about a quarter of all initial projects were abandoned. So for those of you working on your first game or your first firm or second firm, your third firm, know that about 25% of all those first games tend to be abandoned. And then you can see within there which ones were problem, opportunity, and external related. I put in the external one because what I asked was the survey response to tell me a brief description as to why they stopped working on the event. So rather than to ask them to self-report, which was it because of problems or opportunities, I asked why. And then what I did was I had three professional game developers look through all those descriptions and ask them to code them as opportunity-related, problem-related, and give them the option to say it was just external, it was outside the control. A lot of those external ones had to do with a publisher going bankrupt, or another company that was giving them the funding that went out of business. So it was something that was purely outside the control. It wasn't the publisher didn't like the idea anymore and they canceled it. Those were typically coded as problems. But when it was truly something outside the scope of the development team. Opportunity-related ones, let's see if I've got some descriptions here. Do I have time? Yep. I think this is interesting and important to study of how am I actually measuring the types of pathways through which they are abandoned. What we see is, problem would be like, an idea for the game was too ambitious for such a small team, especially given that we were not using any ready-made middleware. That was the description as why it was abandoned, which those professionals coded as problem because it related to the expected value of the current project diminishing. An opportunity is we pivoted from developing a virtual game to a game for Facebook. Now, it's important to note that this is not the only reason potentially. The way I've coded it is the primary reason. So what I'm calling this is the primary reason of abandonment, or primary pathway is abandonment. Is it possible that there were also problems on that? Absolutely. But this is the primary pathway. In terms of how the coders were looking at it, this is what they coded. Those were two examples of how they coded it. What I then did is tested the reliability of them. For those interested, a Fleiss kappa is used when there's multiple raters in multiple categories. Fleiss kappa was a 0.75, which tends to indicate an adequate amount of reliability. That's controlling for the possibility that they could have just all agreed by chance. They could have just been randomly assigning. So that controls for that possibility. So that was my outcome variable, or DV, my time invariant variables. I'm looking at the knowledge of who knows what of the original development team. That's my IV of interest, or theoretical variable. I also controlled for the organizational size, number of employees when the firm was founded. I have the log variable for my models. Team size, resource constraints, so I asked teams or the founder to respond how constrained by resources they were. And then, did they use licensed content or not? The time varying variables, these mean over the time they may change, are publisher funding, equity funding, innovation strategy, and industry size. Publisher funding or equity funding starts off with 0 if you don't have funding, and is a 1 when you receive that funding. So it may start from the beginning as 1 if you had it at firm founding, but let's say you got it 6 months in or 9 months in. You can control for the fact that initially you didn't and later you did. In terms of industry size, I have data that's produced by the ESA, that's actually produced by the NPD, reported by the ESA, for industry sales data in the United States for 96 through 2013. So I've included those to capture how large the industry is at the time. And the innovation strategy, I'm going to tell you I got some good feedback earlier, so we'll probably have to adjust this moving forward. But what I'm trying to capture here is, are you developing on a platform that is new or has been in existence for a while? So how established is the market for games that you're creating games for, and how established is the technology for that platform? With the assumption that the longer the history of the technology of that platform, the more tools that are available, the more knowledge there is in the population or in the industry for you to leverage when you have problems or opportunities, or problems and or opportunities. And in terms of the consumer base or customer base, the longer the history, presumably it's more established, so you know what their preferences are. So I'm trying to capture that. And what I do is I take the release date of the primary platform, the first iteration or first introduction of a platform. So for PlayStation, I'm looking at the introduction of the PlayStation, the first PlayStation, not each subsequent generation of the PlayStation. So I already know that I need to look at this in a little more detail after a few conversations, but I'm going to show you what my results hold. There is one outcome that is meaningful based on the way I'm currently measuring it. So I have 2,414 spells, which means these are periods. So there's 2,414 quarters of development that emerged from that 321 firms. Because I have to account for every single period or spell, which is a 3-month period, that a project might have been in development. This is just descriptive statistics. Given the time, I'm happy to show this to you guys after if you're interested in any of you in the audience. And these are my three models, the competing risks. So, of most interest to me, we're looking at problem opportunity in the far left, opportunity abandonment in the middle, and the monetization at the end. You'll see, let's see if I've got a, yeah, I do. So you can see what I'm doing is I'm introducing a baseline model and then introducing my theoretical or IV hierarchical regression. And what I find is that I find support for hypothesis one that knowledge of who knows what decreases the likelihood of problem-related abandonment. Now this is a conditional probability that the firm will abandon its project. It's conditional on the fact that it remains in development to the next stage. So if it is abandoned, then it's pulled from the sample. So this is always thinking about what is the likelihood that we're going to kill this project, assuming that we've made it this far. And data that are extracted from that analysis are all censored data, meaning if you experience a monetization event, that's not being accounted for after it's been monetized because you can no longer abandon it because of problems. What a 0.30 means here in terms of real terms is that you're 26% less likely to abandon because of problems for 1 unit change in knowledge of who knows what. Okay, what does that mean? What's a 1 unit change in knowledge of who knows what? So there's a scale, a 7-point scale that I use. This would mean that as you move from, say, moderate level of knowledge, as you move from a considerable amount of knowledge of who knows what on your team to a moderately level, did I say that right? Sorry. As you move from a moderate level of knowledge on your team to a considerable amount of knowledge of the expertise on your team, you're 26% less likely to abandon because of problems. So that's how it translates. That scale of knowledge, who knows what, is there are 4 questions associated with it. The scale reliability is a 0.90 alpha. It's a fairly reliable scale. It's been used in other publications before as well. So in terms of problem opportunities, it actually has a much stronger effect. So it's statistically significant at the 0.01 level, and what that 0.658 means is that you're 92% more likely, make sure I get that number, 93% more likely to abandon because of opportunities for a 1 unit increase in knowledge of who knows what. So again, as you move from moderate level of knowledge of your team members to a considerable amount of knowledge of your team members, you're 93% more likely to abandon because of opportunities. What I find interesting here, I'm still trying to figure out, is the only other variable that seems to have a strong or meaningful is when we look at resource constraints, as you might expect. Having resource constraints on your development project increases the likelihood that you're going to result in problem-related abandonment. So as a team perceives that they're constrained by resources, they're more likely to abandon because of problems. And this isn't quite significant at a 0.05 level, but it is at 0.10 level, that the amount of industry sales would increase the likelihood of problem-related abandonment. It just so happens the amount of industry sales also increases the likelihood of opportunity-related abandonment, and as we'll find in the last model, also increases the likelihood of monetization. So if we look at the monetization model, I see lots of things that have an influence over whether you monetize, which many of you are probably more interested in. So the larger your organization, the less likely you are to monetize that first project. For a startup environment, having a larger organization actually reduces the likelihood of monetization. Notice though that team size does not have that same influence. So the larger your team size does not necessarily. You can also imagine those are correlated. But they're not as correlated as you expect them to be. I think we have, what is it, organizational size is 7.54. So it's fairly high which means it's hard to tease out which one's really driving that effect. It seems to be that it's organizational size. I don't really present theory as to why that might be, but if I were to speculate, the more bloated your new organization, the less likely you are to monetize, because you're devoting resources to actions and activities that aren't related to your development. And if you're not focused enough on development, that may actually reduce your likelihood of monetization. Pure speculation though, because I can't really say with the data. And once again, see, resource constraint reduces the likelihood of monetization. Having licensed content, publisher funding, increases the likelihood of monetization, as you would expect. And those are fairly strong effects. And then innovation strategy, although problematic measurements, so I'm going to have to look into that, would suggest it actually reduces the likelihood. And again, this is a 1 unit increase. It has a 3% decrease in your likelihood of abandonment. But 1 unit is 3 months of time. So if you think of a platform that's been available for 2 years, you're reducing the likelihood of monetization by 24%. I say that right? Yeah. Another interesting thing about this model is there's an assumption embedded in continuous time event history models, which is a proportional hazard assumption, meaning that we expect all these effects to hold no matter what time you are in duration of the project. So if you're in period 2 and you're in period 10, these effects should be the same under the assumptions of the model. You can check for those assumptions to see if they're validated or not. And one thing that I found was that my knowledge of who knows what variable, my theoretical variable of interest, actually initially violated that assumption. There seemed to be suggesting that the effect of knowing who knows what on your team is not proportional over time if you're trying to monetize your game. And so there are a series of analyses that you can conduct to correct for that violation by introducing an interaction with duration and your variable. By looking at some of the residuals of that variable, over time you can kind of parse out what moment in time does it appear that it changes. And for those of you who are interested in that kind of modeling, I don't have it with me here today, but in my paper I can show it to you. But it looks like around period 7 there's a shift. And so by increasing that interaction term, what that actually is saying is there's a positive effective knowledge of who knows what on monetization, but after 7 periods it goes away.
7 periods, is that like
7 quarters. So it's a little over a year and a half.
Okay.
In other words, if you don't monetize your game within a year and a half, a little over a year and a half, you're 1.75 years, year and 9 months, that knowledge of who knows what, that original expertise that you had, knowledge of each other's expertise you had on your initial team, it dissipates and it turns into a negligible effect. I mean, I can't really tell if it's positive or negative. There's no statistical significance to it, which I think is interesting in and of itself. And actually, hypothesis 3 is conditionally supported. It only has a positive effect on monetization for the first 7 periods. So what or who cares? My recommendations to you if you're starting up a team is you're inevitably going to face uncertainty at many levels. And sometimes that uncertainty is going to lead to abandonment. Spending upfront time to develop knowledge of each other's expertise can pay dividends in the form of game monetization if you use it quickly enough, and or pivoting because of better opportunities instead of because of problems. So spending that time up front, not just to have a cursory knowledge of, okay, I know you can be a producer, I know you can be the artist, or I know you can be the programmer, but really knowing each other's expertise is well worth the time. So go beyond that surface knowledge and focus on deep knowledge of each other's skills. And when hiring, hire a development team, or consider hiring a development team. It may be better than hiring a star. So if you think about, if we just had a really, really great programmer, we'd be set. You know, my data cannot speak directly to this, so this is a little bit of me speculating. But what I do have evidence for is that having a strong knowledge of each other's expertise and the whole team knowing who has which expertise is beneficial. So just bringing in that rock star may not be what you need. What you may need is just everyone to know what each other's capable of. The choice of primary platform, as I mentioned, definitely matters as a startup or your first project, although, again, I've got to check that to see if it's a measurement issue or if that's consistent if I change the measurement.
So, can I just interject though?
Yeah.
Your conclusions are almost invalidated by the fact that you keep them to the first project.
Okay.
In my mind, because what I see is, what happens in a lot of companies, or enough companies, is they actually do have a small little team for the first company, for the first hit, and they do well, and then they grow the company with basically people that aren't really on the core team, and then you get into death by committee and a lot of other things that kick in that isn't addressed by your survey, and that kills the company
Okay.
after the initial.
So looking at survival of the company after its initial project.
Right, it's the second one that's.
Yeah. And that's actually, I love the question. It's what I'm trying to develop right now, is I'm trying to understand the inertial effects of both their innovation, but the initial project outcomes and firm survival. So what I'm doing is I have data on 2,900 founders as part of that research collection that I'm now cleaning. And I'm really interested in how those founding team backgrounds influence that first project, and then how that first project influences subsequent survival of the firm. And it sounds like what you're saying is that you may have a first hit, but then you grow the team, become bloated, and then die.
Yeah.
Okay.
Sounds like the sophomore slump that they thinking that earlier.
I think
You
it's
have a really good beginning and then you try to catch fire the ball again, and somebody's taking the ball again and you fail.
You change the rules is what happens.
It's a really interesting question, and one I hope I can get to in a subsequent study. I certainly can't address it in this one. Other comments, questions? I'm happy to, in fact, because I know we're closing in on the hour. Just skip past my studies.
We do a lot of dry runs before the other teams, and what happens might be addressed is a lot of projects I'm working on, we're either in school or we do dry run dummy projects to see people working on it. Because it's blatantly aware who doesn't work when you do a school project, for example. It's becomes very clear who's doing what. So what we've been doing is trying to, when you get the founders, there's often like 100 bags for the first hit, for the first company founding. Also, if you go through resumes, it should be interesting on just what kind of people you have that can work in a fresh team, not lose it after the first project, and still kind of keep like a good team player and understand that the team, when that fails, there's nothing left. You can't just go and build another team that didn't work.
Yeah.
You've got a whole dynamic goes on, which is hard to evaluate, but you've given us some good insight.
So in the interest of parsimony in my model, I actually run robustness checks, and I've captured a variable called development team experience, which essentially asks the founder how much experience developing games did your development team have. And included in the models, it didn't change the results, and it was insignificant, so I left it out of these models. The other variable that I included to try to capture some of this is that I've heard this from a lot of entrepreneurs before, and there's a literature on startup team experience. So I asked the founders how much experience they had starting up other organizations or other firms prior to this one, and similar result. Including in the model didn't change the results, and they were insignificant. But it's something that sounds like I may want to keep in, at least to avoid the concern that maybe it's these other things that are driving it.
Can you tell the range of size of companies you dealt with here?
Yeah, shoot, I forgot the log. This is in log terms, so the average team size is 5, and I don't know what the log would convert that, but I believe the organizational sizes range from 2 to 50. But I'll have to check my original paper.
So wait, you want log of 5, correct? No, or do you
No,
want
the
E of
development
5?
team size I didn't log for the models,
So he wants E of 5. Find the number.
but if you want to exponentiate that, at least the mean variable. Yes.
Jerry, what does team cohesiveness contribute to the fail or success of the project?
Yeah, it's a valid concern and something I wish I could have measured in my survey. It's actually something I'm getting closer to with the global game jam research. So, which I'm not talking about tonight, but I've got the data and I'll start cleaning it and finding analyses. But the nice thing about the global game jam data is I'm able to tease apart some of these microprocessors a little bit better because I was able to. Those who filled out the survey, thank you, first of all. They really got some nice nuanced measures of conflict on the team, both relational and task. I got some nice measures of team learning behaviors as well as this transactive memory stuff, the knowledge of expertise. So I'll be able to parse that out a little bit more from those data, but these data I can't. Oftentimes, cohesiveness or familiarity are antecedents to knowledge of who knows what. So in a lot of transactive memory systems, and in those studies, what they do is they help manipulate it by giving those teams experience working together before they actually run their studies to manipulate that knowledge.
Did
So
you throw out
having prior experience helps.
Did you throw out teams in one? You did, right?
I did, yeah, sorry, I should have mentioned that. These are only teams of 2 and greater, because I was really interested in awareness of the team, of each other's expertise. And I've had arguments for keeping the 1 in and just saying that, well, if it's just you, you're completely aware of your own expertise. Sometimes, yes.
Control group against the others.
I can look at teams of 1 versus teams of more than 1 and, in a variety of other ways, but not for this study. Yep.
Do you think the reason that the organizational size seemed so important was because not everyone could know what everyone else was doing, even if everyone was necessary, it wasn't necessarily bloated, the knowledge of who knows what, it was too many people to keep track of for each person. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so I think if that were the case, which I can't rule out that maybe team size is somehow confounding my knowledge of who knows what variable. So maybe the reliability of that variable is somehow compromised by looking at, and I guess I could look at this. I could look at the knowledge of who knows what variable for smaller teams versus bigger teams and see if there's meaningful differences. So maybe I should do that. Sorry, I just got to make note here. Small. But the development team size had a negligible effect.
Right.
So it wasn't necessarily that the development team was compromising the ability to know each other's expertise.
The organization.
It doesn't seem to suggest the organization size was influencing their ability to know each other. It was just that controlling for how much knowledge of each other's expertise the development team had, the larger the organization seemed to reduce the likelihood of monetization. Does that help? Hopefully that answers your question.
How does this relate to mobile? And the reason why I'm asking, because I know this is a body of work that started way back when, and since mobile is now taken off, is it still relevant in reference to mobile?
I can't answer that question directly. What I can say is that if my innovation strategy is measured properly, so if it's a valid measure, which may be an assumption at this point, then where it would be relevant for mobile is if you're a startup, you want to get in on mobile as soon as possible, just like any other platform. You want to get in as soon as the platform is released. That's going to give you the highest likelihood of monetization. In terms of answering your question, how this relates to mobile versus others, I could take that same platform data and include specific variables for, say, mobile environments, console environments, PC environments, and see if there's a meaningful effect of the type of broad category of platform.
But the original study was PC and console?
This includes mobiles, consoles, Facebook, you name it, smartphones,
Okay.
web.
Cool.
Every platform that would be possible, and it's the primary platform they were developing for.
Write that Oculus Rift out.
I don't think, frankly, I'm looking at the data, I know I don't have any Oculus Rifts, but yes, that would be.
And I'd argue that mobile's taken off.
But would you want to write the Google Glass out?
No.
Yeah. So I mean, sometimes it's.
I mean,
No.
again, I can't speak to specific platforms.
People who pay $1,500 for it. So
Two people hitting home runs,
Well,
and
take that
failing,
into
it's
account.
not taking off.
I was just wondering, it's obvious why there's difference in monetization between like publisher funding and equity funding, because publishers can bring your audience and feature something, all kinds of things like that. But I I was curious if there was a difference in abandonment and if you had any observations, just looking at publisher funding versus equity funding, in terms of how that affects teams.
What are you saying in terms of whether or not that has influence over the likelihood of abandonment?
Yes.
So what I find is that neither it has a statistically significant influence over the likelihood of abandonment. Problem-related abandonment or opportunity, I'd have to collapse those two to run a model that just looks at all abandonments together to look at that. But it doesn't seem to have an effect on the two different pathways included in those competing risks. Controlling for everything else in my model, on everything else in the world.
When you talk about resource constraint, how correlated that is with problem-related abandonment, I wonder two things. Its resource constraint was self-reported, how constrained they felt by resources?
It was a perceived resource constraint, yes. It was a 7-point scale looking at how constrained by resources was the development team. I think that wording in front of me.
So one question is, have you examined whether that's really representing a latent variable like optimism? Right, so as the problems mount, you feel more constrained by resources even though you're not, and that's coloring that self-report.
No, I mean, I haven't considered the possibility, nor would I be able to measure, given my data, a latent variable like optimism. It is certainly possible that individual attributes of the survey respondent may have influenced some of these. There doesn't seem to be any bias. I haven't looked at resource constraints specifically, but I have looked at potential survey response bias. For instance, you might those who responded versus those who didn't, and why didn't they? And I didn't find any evidence of potential survey response bias. I can think about how to maybe get at individual differences. I have information on who filled it out. Maybe I can get something on their career histories, but it's possible. I wouldn't expect it to. There's not a lot in the evidence that I'm aware of that would say someone who's more optimistic would answer that question differently. It's possible. It's entirely possible. And if that were true, so here would be the other argument you can make. So anytime you have, what's your name again? Jesse. So what Jesse's referring to is potential for omitted variable bias in the model. I've left out something that is critical that might explain the results in a different way. If that were to be true, then we would have to also, not only would optimism have to influence our resource constraint measure, have to be correlated with resource constraint meaningfully, it would also have to be correlated with each of the outcome variables. So typically you have omitted variable bias if the omitted variable is not only correlated to your independent variables, but it's also correlated to your outcome variables. Which is possible. I mean, optimism might lead to more abandonment, higher abandonment, might lead to higher rates of monetization. Yeah.
So the key variable isn't who knows what, it's the knowledge of who knows what. And so,
Exactly.
so the study isn't really saying this kind of skill set or set of experiences best predicts success. It's what does team member A know about team member B's knowledge. So with that as a predicate, I guess I'm wondering if, even despite that, if there are implications for this research on knowing how teams might best be put together beyond just filling this slot and that slot and that slot. Are there is there a way to go from this question to the more foundational question of how to put a team together?
Right, the team compositions, yeah. So I do actually have some data on that. I just think it's really coarse and I'm not finding any influence. Again, I left them out of these models. So I have measures on diversity of the team. So how diverse your team is would be a measure of, take the number of people on your team, let's say 5. If everyone had a different set of expertise, you'd have maximum diversity, at least in terms of variety measure. And if everyone had the same, it would be the minimum amount, or 0. And when I included that variable, it didn't have an impact on any of the outcomes, but I truly believe it's just such a coarse measure given the survey. So in the global game jam data that I've collected, which is much more recent, it still is the 48-hour game development environment, I have data on the individual backgrounds of some of the survey respondents and then measures of how the team was composed too, and I'm hoping to get at that. One of the hypotheses for that study is that this knowledge of who knows what variable would interact with a diversity measure. So it's not just diversity or knowledge of who knows what, but when you put the two together and you have a really diverse team and they all know each other's expertise, that has a magnified effect on outcomes like creativity and innovation, subsequent monetization.
Part of why I'm asking is because the way you framed it sort of implies that the real challenge is a communication problem. That is getting team members to bond or to talk to each other so they know. But really, that may be a part of it, but another possibility might be that if we're on a team together, my background and experience ought to overlap yours enough so that I kind of know that if you came from this program or work for this company, that I know what that means. It's not that you and I have to go drinking together after
No,
this.
and actually it was in a previous conversation before the talk today. It's definitely not this. The measure items have nothing to do with let's go have a beer together or what's your favorite color.
Or just the interaction effect of being in the same office environment or talking.
And again, prior studies of looking at transactive memory show that the more experience you have working together is going to increase your knowledge of each other's expertise, which isn't earth-shattering, but it's definitely important to this study too, right? So if you're starting a company, my recommendation is you're much better off working with a team of people that you know each other's expertise really well than saying, you know what, I really need a programmer, so let me go find a programmer. Which I hear all the time, and I hear all the time at GGDA meetings where students are coming in and saying, I want to start this company, but I really don't have any artist skills. I need an artist. And maybe you do. My study would suggest what you really need is somebody who you know their expertise really well. And if you don't have that, go out, get some experience, not with your firm, get to know their expertise, and then potentially think about moving forward. My advice earlier to a couple gentlemen was, if you think about hiring someone, and let's say you started your company and you're thinking about hiring someone, I would not go out and hire someone right away. I'd hire them on a contracting basis for a while. Get to know their expertise before you make that investment. Allow the rest of your team to get to know their expertise really well and make the evaluation, as opposed to saying, you know what, we need something, so let's go hire something. I know we're way past time. I really apologize. So these are great questions. I'd love to get more, but I don't want to make the rest of you endure through more of me. Trust me, my students, I tell them all the time, if I talk this much in class, I've failed. So I hope I didn't fail tonight. I do have data on the Global Game Jam, so if those of you are interested in learning more about that or have ideas for research on that, please let me know. I was recently asked to be the research chair for the Global Game Jam and accepted that position. So if you're interested in getting involved in that, we want to get as many people involved as possible as we move forward in a research community. So with that being said, thank you for doing this. Thank you for your great suggestions and comments. It definitely is going to make my study better, and my audiences will appreciate that. So, thank you.